The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song above Margaret Walsh's head as she moved through the night shift corridors of Mercy General, a ghost in faded scrubs navigating the familiar geography of pain and recovery. She had learned, over 3 years, to make herself invisible. It was a skill. The graying hair pulled back into a severe bun, the way her eyes stayed downcast when passing the surgical staff, the quiet murmur of her voice when speaking to patients, all of it deliberate, calculated, designed to pass through these hallways without leaving a mark. The hospital at 2 a.m. was hers. The day staff didn't understand this. They didn't understand that night shift was where the real work happened, where the monitors beat their truths without an audience, where a nurse's hands were the only thing standing between a patient and a downward spiral. She checked the vitals on cardiac recovery, room for 12, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. The patient's oxygen saturation was climbing, 88% now, 91% by the time she finished charting. Good. She noted the new post-op orders on his chart, frowning slightly at the morphine dosage Dr. Sterling had prescribed. Too high. She could feel it in her bones the way some people could feel rain coming. The morphine dose was aggressive, borderline reckless for a cardiac patient with borderline renal function. She noted the serum creatinine, 2.1 milligrams per deciliter, and the calculation was simple. The drug would accumulate. Not immediately. But it would accumulate. Margaret moved to the next room, her bag in one hand, her stethoscope already around her neck before she needed it. This was the thing about night shift at Mercy General, you worked alone, which meant you worked differently. There was no hierarchy when there were only nurses. There was no one to impress, no one to perform for. Just the work. Just the patients. Just the quiet hiss of oxygen flowing through cannulas and the soft beep of monitors tracking the fragile architecture of human vitality. Her coffee thermos sat in the break room, dented on one corner from being dropped into a footlocker 14 years ago in a place she no longer spoke about. She hadn't opened that thermos in 3 years. She just liked knowing it was there. At 6 a.m., the hospital changed. The fluorescent light seemed to burn brighter. The hallways filled with purpose and voices and the scrape of chairs being pulled toward conference tables. Morning rounds were starting. Margaret had already been awake for 6 hours. She finished her charting at the nurse's station, the clicking of her keyboard the only sound in the moment before Dr. Sterling stepped into the surgical wing with 3 residents trailing behind him like pilot fish in the wake of a predatory fish. He was 52, maybe 53, with the kind of tan that came from regular tennis games and a house in the Heights with a view. His shoes were Italian leather. His watch was a Rolex Submariner. Everything about him moved like wealth had never failed him once. Dr. Sterling paused at room for 12. He didn't look at the monitor. He didn't look at the patient. He looked at the chart. His eyes moved down the vital signs with the speed of someone who had stopped truly reading them years ago, when his authority had become so established that reading felt redundant. Margaret watched from her desk 40 feet away, unseen. This was the architecture of invisibility. When you stayed quiet, people forgot you were there. When you wore the right amount of gray in your hair and kept your eyes downcast, even the brightest lights in the room seemed to pass over you like you were furniture. Push a 15-milligram bolus of morphine every 4 hours, Sterling said to the resident on his left, not looking up from the chart. Post-op pain management should be aggressive. These patients expect comfort. The resident wrote the order down without questioning. The resident was young, maybe 28, with the kind of certainty that comes from being told every day that you're the smartest person in the room. Margaret felt something in her chest tighten, the same sensation she'd learned to recognize years ago as the moment when wrong became dangerous. But she said nothing. This was the art of 3 years at Mercy General, knowing when to speak and knowing when speaking would cost more than silence. The rounds continued. Sterling moved with the smooth confidence of a man who had never been questioned and did not expect to start. His white coat was pressed. His stethoscope was a luxury model, the earpieces crafted from titanium. He spoke about the patients the way a collector might speak about objects in a museum, with a kind of detached appreciation for his own role in preserving them. Two residents hung on his every word. One looked like she was taking notes on how to walk with that particular brand of arrogance. When the rounds ended and the group dissolved back into the corridors, Sterling remained, scrolling through his phone with the absorbed focus of a man who had no doubt that everything around him would continue functioning perfectly in his absence. Margaret clocked out at 7:15 a.m., changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, and walked through the parking garage toward her 2007 Honda Accord. The hospital was transitioning from night to day now, the shift change creating a brief moment of overlap where both worlds existed simultaneously. The morning sun was already brutal in Houston. The asphalt radiated heat like it was angry. She opened her trunk and pressed the combination on the small steel toolbox bolted to the frame, 8-7-4-6, and the lock clicked open with a sound that belonged to a different life entirely. The combat boots sat on top of a folded uniform, desert tan, the leather cracked and stained with dust from Marjah. Her hands didn't shake now. The tremor that appeared during sirens was nowhere to be found. She had learned to compartmentalize the tremor, to store it somewhere that only the sirens could unlock. Looking at the boots, at the call sign embossed on the inside of one of them, at the fabric that still smelled faintly of diesel exhaust and gunpowder, she felt something like the inverse of trembling, a kind of absolute stillness. The boots had killed her former self. They had also kept her alive. She locked the toolbox again and closed the trunk. The decision to become invisible had been made 3 years ago, when the nightmares had fractured her into pieces small enough to hide in a locker. When every siren outside the ER became incoming mortars. When a patient's scream in post-op recovery became the scream of a 19-year-old private with his leg pinned under a Humvee. The invisibility wasn't weakness. It was armor. It was the only disguise that made the pain manageable. But that invisibility was about to collide with someone who had built his entire existence on being seen. Margaret's shift rotation brought her back to Mercy General 3 nights later. The morning rounds were already underway when she arrived to cover the night shift gap, and she found herself trailing Sterling's entourage through the surgical wing again. She had been dreading this moment. She had also been expecting it. The cardiac patient in room for 12, the one with the elevated morphine dosage, had developed a complication overnight. His respiratory rate had dropped to 8 breaths per minute. His oxygen saturation, without intervention, would have drifted into the danger zone like a ship drifting toward rocks. She had caught it at midnight, reversed the latest morphine dose, and called respiratory to bring in a BiPAP machine to provide pressure support. The patient was stable now. But the orders were still wrong. Sterling stood at the bedside, studying the chart, his expression the same smooth confidence as before. Margaret stood 4 feet behind him, her hands folded in front of her, her voice ready with the exact words that needed to be spoken and nothing more. The residents waited for Sterling's assessment. The patient slept on the BiPAP, his breathing assisted now, his face covered by the mask. The respiratory depression, Margaret said softly, not stepping forward. The morphine dosage. 15 milligrams every 4 hours for a patient with a creatinine of 2.1, the drug accumulates. His metabolism can't clear it. Dr. Sterling turned. His eyes found her as if he was surprised to discover she could speak. As if he was surprised she could think. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, quiet, heavy, containing vast power. "Did I ask for your opinion?" Margaret met his eyes for exactly half a second. When she looked away, she was already a nurse again. "Just a nurse." "No, sir. I apologize." He smiled then, and the smile was the moment everything changed. "Let's keep it that way." The surgeon's lounge at Mercy General smelled like burnt coffee and surgical pride. Dr. Sterling held court that morning, his tailored white coat draped across the back of a leather chair like a general's cloak, surrounded by 5 residents and 2 attending physicians. His voice carried the particular confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. "That Walsh woman," he said, loud enough for Margaret to hear as she passed in the hallway outside, restocking supplies from a crash cart. "I give her a week. Maximum. Anyone want to take that bet?" The laughter that followed was the kind that echoed, sharp, affirming, the sound of a hierarchy being reinforced. Margaret kept walking. Her hands remained steady. The wheels of the crash cart squeaked beneath her fingers as she moved down the corridor, and she did not turn around. 3 days later, the cafeteria was packed at 12:56 p.m. Margaret had timed her lunch break to avoid the peak crowd, but Sterling had other plans. He stood near the condiment station, watching the crowd thin, waiting. She knew this because she could feel his attention the way a hunted animal senses a predator's gaze. She had learned to read rooms like this during her years. The military had taught her that survival was often a matter of observing what others missed. She carried her tray carefully, a grilled chicken sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water, nothing that would make noise if it fell. Muscle memory. Always plan for the worst outcome. Her son had learned that from her before she learned it from him. Sterling stepped directly into her path 3 feet from her preferred table. She was close enough to smell the cologne he wore, something expensive, something that announced itself like rank insignia. "Excuse me, Doctor," Margaret said quietly, the words coming from the part of her voice reserved for politeness, the part she had cultivated like a mask. She moved to step around him. He smiled. That was the only warning she got. His forearm came up smooth and deliberate, connecting with the underside of her tray. The sandwich flipped skyward, rotating once, landing face down on the tile floor beside her shoe. The apple rolled under a nearby table, disappearing into shadow. Water splashed across her scrub top in a spreading stain the color of a bruise. The cafeteria went silent. 20 staff members. Maybe more. Margaret could feel their eyes like weight. She took one measured breath. In through her nose. Out through her mouth. The kind of breathing they teach you when you're standing in a room where people are dying and panic is contagious. A single tear escaped her left eye. It traced down her cheek with a kind of inevitability that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with pressure finding release through the only valve available. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Sterling. Her hand moved once, efficient, and the tear was gone. "I've been called worse by better men," she said. Her voice emerged like steel wrapped in velvet, something soft on the surface with something hard at its core. The room went dead silent. Not because of volume. Because of what lived underneath the words. Sterling's smile widened. That was the dangerous part. He had not flinched. He had not felt corrected. He had felt challenged, and he was the type of man who could not tolerate a challenge from someone he had already decided was beneath him. His eyes moved across her face like he was cataloging something for later reference. "Clean that up, sweetheart," he said, and walked away. Margaret knelt slowly. Her knees made no sound against the tile. She gathered the sandwich carefully, though it was ruined, and placed it on her tray. She retrieved the apple from under the table. It had rolled to a spot where she had to reach, had to stay kneeling longer than was necessary. 2 residents nearby pretended to study the menu board above the serving line. They looked anywhere but at her. That was mercy, of a sort. She carried the ruined tray to the trash and disposed of it. Her hands were steady. Her breathing had returned to baseline. She purchased a replacement sandwich from the grab-and-go section and ate it alone in her car in the parking garage, 47 minutes into her 30-minute break. The sandwich tasted like nothing. She didn't taste anything. This was another skill she had learned long ago, the ability to continue functioning in the absence of sensation. When she returned to Mercy General, her shift had 6 hours remaining. She completed her assignment with the kind of efficiency that went unnoticed because efficiency, when it is perfect, becomes invisible. She did not look for Sterling. She did not avoid him. She moved through the hospital the way she moved through the world, present, competent, gone. The following afternoon, Sterling found her in the ICU corridor restocking the supply cabinet near the nurse's station. Patient charts were stacked in her arms, 7 of them, color-coded by severity. His presence arrived before his voice did. She could feel the air pressure change when he moved into spaces. Walsh. Not a greeting. An announcement. She turned. The charts remained in her arms, balanced against her ribs. He was holding a stack of documents, patient histories, post-op notes, lab results, the administrative detritus of a surgical floor. He held them loosely, like they weighed nothing. To him, they probably didn't. They were just paper. They were just a mechanism. He let them fall. Not scattered. Dropped. The stack separated as it fell, papers spinning, settling across 6 feet of tile like snow. One page caught the edge of her shoe. Another landed face up, revealing a patient name and date of birth that was now legible to anyone who passed. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said. His smile was a knife. His tone was conversational. 2 residents stood 10 feet away, pretending to study a cardiac monitor. They had heard him. They were watching. They had made the calculation that witnessing this was better than intervening. Margaret knelt. She gathered each page. Her movements were slow and deliberate, not reluctant, but not obedient either. Something in the precision of her motion suggested that she was performing a task, not accepting an insult. She stacked the pages carefully, aligned them, checked for any that had slipped under equipment. It took 6 minutes. She handed them back to him in a neat stack. "Thank you," Sterling said. His eyes were bright. He had fed on this. He had needed this. That night, she sat in her car in the parking garage for 40 minutes. The engine was off. The air inside grew cool and then cold. She stared at the steering wheel without seeing it, her hands resting on her thighs, her breathing barely moving her chest. A security guard passed 2 rows over, his flashlight sweeping across vehicles. She did not move. She was not hiding. She was not doing anything. She was simply waiting for the feeling to pass. She drove home without turning on the radio. The silence in the car was the kind of silence that accumulates, layer upon layer of everything she was not saying, everything she was not allowing herself to feel, compressing into something that had the density of a held breath. The next shift assignment was waiting for her on the charge nurse's desk. The surgical recovery floor. 16 post-op patients. 3 nurses. It was, technically, possible to manage. It was also a form of punishment calculated to break her through exhaustion. Sterling had reassigned her personally. He was standing at the nurse's station when she arrived at 6:55 a.m., 3 minutes before her shift began. "Recovery floors all yours, Margaret," he said, loud enough for the charge nurse to hear, loud enough for the nursing students rotating through to understand the hierarchy. "Let's see what you're really made of." "Yes, doctor," Margaret said. She took the assignment sheet from his hands, their fingers not touching. That night, at 11:19 p.m., the ambulance radio crackled. The volume in the emergency department shifted. Something had arrived. Something important. Inbound trauma, Delta Force VIP, gunshot wound to the chest, training accident Fort Hood, ETA 6 minutes, requesting all trauma staff. The dispatcher's voice was clipped, professional, the way it sounded when the hospital was about to receive someone who mattered. Margaret was restocking the crash cart in the trauma bay when she heard the transmission. She had been assigned to the ER for this shift, a gift from the scheduling gods or perhaps a final test before Sterling moved for her termination. Her hands paused for exactly 1 second. Then she moved toward the trauma bay, pulling on gloves, her movements suddenly sharper, more efficient, her entire body realigning toward a center of gravity that had nothing to do with the hospital and everything to do with something she had buried 3 years ago. The ambulance doors burst open at 11:53 p.m. 4 soldiers in dress uniforms flanked a gurney. One of them was a captain. Young. Sharp jawline. Eyes like stone. He did not look at her. He did not know she was in the room. He did not know she was in Houston. The patient was 52 years old, semi-conscious, bleeding. A sucking chest wound. Field dressing packed tight. Colonel James Mercer, Delta Force, the man who had commanded the unit that kept her son alive in Syria, the man whose name on the manifest had made her decision to take the hospital assignment in Houston feel less like running away and more like returning to something. Dr. Reyes was moving, assessing, calling orders. Margaret stepped forward. Her voice dropped lower without any conscious effort. Penetrating chest trauma. Left side. Breath sounds diminished bilateral. Heart rate 136. BP 88/56. She was not speaking to the room. She was speaking to the emergency. The emergency listened. They moved Mercer to the surgical suite. Sterling took the case personally. For hours. Margaret watched from the ICU prep area as they wheeled him out, his chest bandaged, the surgery complete, a success, another feather for Sterling's coat. At 4:24 a.m., Colonel Mercer was moved to the ICU. Post-op monitoring. Stable for now. Resting. The assignment came at shift change. Margaret. Mercer. 12 hours. Sterling delivered it personally, handing her the chart with the kind of smile that suggested he did not know what he had done. He was setting her up to fail. He was assigning her to a VIP patient, a Delta Force colonel, knowing that any mistake would be catastrophic. Knowing that if something went wrong, if the patient crashed, if there was any complication, she would be the one held responsible. But he did not know that Colonel James Mercer was the only person alive who could place her somewhere else. He did not know that those for soldiers in dress uniforms included her son. He did not know that he had just turned his instrument of punishment into the very thing that would unmake him. The night shift began at 11 p.m. Margaret sat beside Mercer's bed, monitoring the lines, the numbers climbing and falling across the screens, watching the man who had kept her son alive breathe in a steady, machine-assisted rhythm. Oxygen saturation at 97%. Blood pressure holding. Heart rate slow and regulated. Everything was stable. Everything was exactly as it should be. But something was moving inside her, waking up, the part of her that had walked away from this life suddenly recognizing that the life had never actually left. The ambulance sirens cut through the pre-dawn Houston heat like a predator's howl, and Margaret heard them from the supply room where she was restocking the trauma cart at 11:19 p.m. She didn't look up. She'd heard 17 ambulances that shift, and 17 was a normal Tuesday night at Mercy General. But the dispatch radio crackled something different: male, 58, abdominal trauma, Delta Force uniform, ETA for minutes. Margaret's hand stopped moving. The bandage box went still in her fingers. She was in Bay 3 when they wheeled him through the automatic doors on a stretcher that squeaked against the tile floor with each pump of the paramedic's hands, and the moment she saw his face, weathered like desert stone, that particular set to his jaw that command presence gives you, her breath caught. Colonel Marcus Mercer. The same officer whose unit photograph sat beside her son's bunk at Fort Bragg. The same man she'd seen in exactly 3 video calls from overseas, the background always blurred, always that voice saying her boy was solid, was squared away, was going to make it home. Her son. Because of this man. She moved toward him without deciding to move, clipboard forgotten somewhere behind her, and registered the paramedic's hands-off report like it was happening to someone else. Blunt force abdominal trauma, struck by an IED fragment at a training op in San Antonio, loss of consciousness for approximately 90 seconds, BP dropped to 88 systolic en route but stabilized with 2 liters of normal saline, abdomen distended, positive fast scan, urgent surgical consult recommended. Mercer's eyes were half open, unfocused, the way trauma patients looked when their bodies were already halfway to shut down. His right hand lay open on the stretcher rail, palm up, and Margaret could see the tremor in his fingers, not fear, that involuntary earthquake of a system starved of oxygen. Dr. Reyes arrived from trauma surgery, moving with the controlled urgency of someone who'd done this 14,000 times, and Margaret stepped back into the wall, became invisible again. But her eyes never left Mercer's face. The colonel. The man who'd kept her son breathing when the bullets came. The man who'd looked into a camera in some FOB she'd never know the name of and said, "Your mother raised you right, Walsh. We're bringing you home." And now he was here, pale as surgical gloves, bleeding into his own abdomen, and if Reyes missed something, if the surgical team made even one wrong move, if the ticking clock of his blood pressure decided to stop cooperating, She cut the thought off. That was old thinking. That was the thinking of someone who'd lived in hospital trauma bays for deployments, someone who'd held a compress against an arterial wound while a medevac landed in white oak conditions. That was the thinking of a person she wasn't anymore. The surgical team assembled with the smooth precision of people who'd learned their choreography in rooms like this one, and Margaret watched Mercer's vitals trend upward slightly as the anesthesia kicked in, BP holding at 128/82, heart rate down from 107 to 91, color returning to his face as the four fluids worked their small miracle of keeping cells alive. Reyes ordered a surgical exploration to find the bleed and repair whatever the fragment had torn through his peritoneum, and Margaret heard herself volunteering before the words left her mouth, "I can take post-op monitoring if you need coverage tonight." Professional. Neutral. The voice of someone who'd learned 3 years ago how to hide behind the words required. Reyes didn't hesitate. Recovery, second shift through 8 a.m. if you're willing. He'll need close watching. Combat trauma sometimes surprises us. Reyes said it to her like she was just another qualified nurse. Not like she was Margaret Walsh, Senior Chief Petty Officer, who'd watched trauma in a different desert, under a different sky. Not like she was someone's mother watching her own worst fear made flesh on a stretcher. "I'll take him," Margaret said. The surgery lasted for hours and 16 minutes. Margaret sat in the recovery area, monitoring banks of machines that tracked Mercer's descent into the artificial sleep of anesthesia, and felt the weight of it settling around her chest like a sandbag, the personal stake of it, the way proximity to someone who'd changed your child's survival odds suddenly made you human again instead of phantom. Her combat boots sat locked in her car trunk 3 floors below, untouched for 3 years except for the nights when she couldn't sleep and went down to the parking garage just to stare at them through the car window. But her hands remembered other nights. Her eyes remembered reading numbers on monitors when the difference between 87 and 84 oxygen saturation meant someone's family got a phone call that started with "I'm sorry." By 5:56 a.m., Mercer was in a patient room on the recovery floor, chest intubated, breathing on a machine with the soft rhythm of something half alive. Margaret checked his drain output, sanguineous, meaning bloody, which was normal post-op. She checked his vital signs, stable. Blood pressure 140/90. Heart rate 72. O2 sat 96%. All green lights. The kind of numbers that let you sleep in a real bed instead of pulling a chair close to the bedside in case something went wrong. She'd been checking in on him every 30 minutes through the dark hours, the routine of wound assessment and vital sign documentation, when at 6:15 a.m. she noticed the shift. Not dramatic. Not the kind of thing the monitors would alarm over. Just a slight creep downward in the blood pressure, 140 sliding to 130, then to 120, like a boat coming loose from its moorings 1 knot at a time. She checked the monitors again. The numbers weren't wrong. She checked his drain output, now dark red instead of pink tinged, which meant fresh bleeding instead of normal post-op seepage. 12 minutes later, the pressure dropped again. 110, then 102. His heart rate bumped up from 72 to 94 to 108, as if the organ itself was panicking, beginning to understand what the numbers meant. Margaret's jaw clenched. She pressed her fingers against the lateral aspect of Mercer's neck, feeling for the jugular vein, and found it distended like a rope pulled taut. The muffled heart sounds followed when she listened with her stethoscope, the normal lub-dub muted, almost distant, like the sound was coming through water. She'd heard it before. She'd heard it in Marjah when shrapnel had nicked a pericardium and blood started accumulating in the sac around the heart itself, the very space where the organ needed to expand and contract. Pericardial tamponade. Blood filling the wrong cavity. The heart crushed in its own chest. She paged Dr. Reyes. No response. She paged again. This time the return message said, "Emergency C-section, maternity complications, unavailable, contact Dr. Ashton, cardiothoracic on call." Dr. Ashton picked up on the second ring, listened to her report in the clinical staccato of someone trained to extract meaning from fragments, and said he was in traffic, maybe 30 minutes. Maybe 35. Meanwhile, start a chest X-ray and push 2 liters of normal saline. The words were competent and professional and completely divorced from the fact that Margaret was watching Mercer's systolic pressure drop below 100, then below 90, sliding toward the 80s like someone descending a staircase into a basement where the lights didn't work. She activated the rapid response code. The overhead intercom announced it, and 3 residents appeared within minutes like they'd been waiting for permission to be scared. Margaret's voice came out level, clipped, the way it had come out in Marjah, possible post-surgical pericardial tamponade. Blood filling the pericardial sac. His heart sounds are muffled. JVD positive. Pressure's tanking. The words hung in the room like someone had turned off gravity. One of the residents pulled the ultrasound machine. Another started a second full line. The third one just stood there, watching Mercer's chest rise and fall with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator, waiting for someone to tell him what to do. Margaret checked the drain output again. Nearly dry. Which meant the bleeding wasn't coming out of the surgical drain. Which meant it was accumulating inside, in the pericardium, in the space around the heart itself, compressing it with every beat, stealing oxygen from every tissue in his body. She could feel her own heart rate climbing to meet his, that old synchronization between combat medic and critical patient, the way your body anticipates what's coming. 30 seconds later, Mercer's systolic pressure dropped to 78. She reached for the phone to call Sterling, knowing even as she did it that he wouldn't answer. He never answered pages when the crisis happened on her shift. But she called anyway, left a message, professional and urgent, and ignored. The cardiothoracic surgeon was still in traffic somewhere. The on-call residents were looking at her with that expression people wore when they knew something was wrong but didn't know what needed to happen next. Margaret stood at the foot of Mercer's bed, watching the man who'd kept her son alive in a place called Marjah, watching his oxygen levels drop 94, 91, 87, watching his body run out of time in the mathematical way that trauma never lies about. She thought about the board investigation. She thought about the anonymity she'd built, 3 years of quiet, 3 years of no one knowing, 3 years of being invisible so thoroughly that even she'd started to believe she'd erased the person underneath. Then she thought about Marjah. She thought about 47 lives. She thought about hands that had learned to work faster than panic, faster than fear, faster than the mathematics of death. She looked at the nearest resident. Get me the pericardiocentesis kit from the crash cart. The kit came in a sterile package, needle and catheter and 3 different gauges, and Margaret's hands didn't shake as she opened it. They never shook. That was the thing about muscle memory. Fear couldn't move hands that had been trained in muscle, only in mind, and her muscles remembered Marjah. Margaret's hands didn't hesitate. The needle, 14-gauge angiocath, precisely calibrated, moved toward the narrow space between Mercer's ribs like it was following a map her body had memorized 1,000 times over. 5th intercostal space, midclavicular line. The ultrasound screen glowed in the dim light, showing the pericardial sac distended with dark fluid compressing his heart like a fist closing around something fragile. Her shoulders settled. Her breathing steadied to match the rhythm of the ventilator beside her. This wasn't a hospital ICU in Houston anymore. This was muscle memory operating on muscle memory, the same hands that had threaded needles in a sandstorm outside Marjah with mortar rounds landing 200 meters away, the same hands that had saved 17 operators in ditches and compounds and caves where the only light was muzzle flash. The needle slid in. The sensation traveled up her forearm, resistance, then release, then the give of membrane puncturing. Dark blood filled the syringe. 60 milliliters. 80. The resident stepped back instinctively, their eyes wide, watching her move with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this not in simulation but under actual fire. The attending resident, a third-year named Kumar, whispered something to the medical student beside him. Margaret didn't hear it. She was reading Mercer's vitals like a sniper reading wind. Blood pressure climbing, 85 systolic. 95, 110. His eyes fluttered, then opened. Recognition flickered across his face. His hand moved, searching for something that wasn't there. Steady, Margaret said softly, her voice like a tank idling in a garage, low and capable of immense force but held in absolute control. "You're safe. You're in the hospital. Your heart was compressing. I just relieved the pressure." She withdrew another 30 milliliters. The pericardial sac decompressing on the ultrasound screen, the heart expanding back to its proper size, the chambers filling and emptying with purpose again. Mercer's oxygen saturation climbed, 89, 93, 96%. His rhythm steadied from the rapid, desperate sprint it had been into something approaching normal. She taped the needle, established a catheter, positioned the collection bag. The procedure that should have required an emergency thoracotomy, that should have demanded the trauma surgeon and the OR staff and 40 minutes of organized chaos, had taken 8 minutes. 8 minutes and one person who knew exactly where to put a needle because she had been putting needles in the right places while shells fell around her. A crowd had gathered at the ICU entrance without Margaret noticing. Nurses. Techs. The ward clerk who never left her station. 2 residents from the night shift who had heard the page and arrived in time to watch. They stood in the doorway like witnesses to something they weren't quite supposed to see, mouths slightly open, eyes tracking from the monitor to Margaret's hands to Mercer's face, where color was returning like someone turning up a dimmer switch on a light. Dr. Sterling arrived 6 minutes later. Margaret heard his shoes first, the expensive leather ones that clicked like impatience against the tile floor. She didn't look up from the monitor where she was documenting Mercer's vital signs, her handwriting as neat and precise as it had ever been, because looking up would have been a concession, and she had decided approximately 2 minutes into this crisis that she would not concede anything to this man ever again. But she felt him arrive. She felt the way the gathered crowd shifted, the way the air pressure changed in the ICU bay, the way someone whispered, "Here he comes." Sterling took in the scene with the rapid assessment of a man whose entire identity was built on being the smartest person in every room. He saw the pericardial catheter. He saw the collection bag with its dark fluid drainage. He saw Mercer's stabilized vitals on the monitor screen. He saw the crowd of hospital staff standing along the wall with expressions ranging from shock to something that looked dangerously close to admiration. He saw his hierarchy, carefully constructed over 17 years of department dominance, crumbling in real time like a sandcastle at high tide. For approximately 3 seconds, Sterling didn't move. His jaw tightened. His right hand, which had been holding a coffee cup, flexed around the ceramic like he was considering throwing it. Then his eyes met Margaret's, and something crystallized behind them, not rage, but something colder and more calculated. Rage was a luxury. What Sterling felt now was the sharp clarity of a threat to his authority that could not be addressed with public humiliation or intimidation. This threat required strategy. He didn't say anything. He turned and walked out of the ICU with the same measured pace he had entered with, and Margaret recognized the walk of someone making decisions in real time, the kind of decisions that would unfold over the next 18 hours in phone calls and emails and carefully worded conversations with people who owed him favors. She was right about the timeline. She was wrong about nothing else. Sterling returned to his office on the 4th floor and began making calls at 7:24 a.m., while Margaret was still in the ICU documenting the procedure with the precision of someone who knew every action would be scrutinized. His first call was to Dr. Richard Hayes, a board member who had voted Sterling's way on committee appointments 3 times in the past 4 years. "Richard, I need to discuss an incident that occurred on my unit this morning regarding patient safety," Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of someone with deep concern rather than personal vendetta. "An unauthorized invasive procedure by night shift nursing staff. Pericardiocentesis. Completely outside their scope. I'm bringing in an outside consultant to document the protocol violations." By 8:15 a.m., Sterling had contacted the credentialing office at Kauai Delta Health in California where Margaret had listed employment 9 years ago. "I'm trying to verify something about a prior employee, a Margaret Walsh, worked night shift there, 2015. I'm wondering if there were any incidents, any concerns about judgment or practice standards." The credentialing coordinator told him she would check their records, that Margaret's file showed exemplary evaluations, nothing concerning at all. Sterling thanked her and made a mental note to follow up in case any documentation could be found that contradicted that. There might not be any, but there was no harm in asking again in 48 hours. By 9:02 a.m., Sterling had placed a call to Dr. Patricia Chen, an independent patient safety consultant he knew from a conference in San Antonio. "I have a situation where a nurse performed a procedure outside her credentials. I need documentation. I need it handled carefully because we're talking about a life safety issue but also a personnel matter. Can you come this week?" Chen agreed. Sterling never mentioned that Margaret had saved the patient's life. He focused on the protocol violation, the scope creep, the dangerous precedent of nurses overstepping their boundaries. When examined from that angle, the facts were actually quite damning. Margaret was called to the chief nursing officer's office at 2:17 p.m. She wasn't told why. She wasn't told who would be in the room. She simply received the message through the nursing supervisor that she needed to report to the 4th floor immediately, and something in the quality of the supervisor's avoidance of eye contact told her that her 3 years of invisibility had ended in the worst possible way. The CNO was a woman named Dr. Helena Foster, someone Margaret had worked around for 3 years without having more than 5 conversations with. Foster gestured to the chair across from her desk. Beside Foster sat a woman Margaret didn't recognize, wearing the kind of blazer that signaled consultant status. Sterling was not in the room, which meant he had already set this in motion and was now letting the institutional machinery handle the rest. "Margaret, there was an incident in the ICU this morning," Foster said quietly. "A pericardiocentesis performed during a patient emergency. The documentation indicates this procedure was performed by you. A registered nurse, not an advanced practice provider. The patient was in cardiac tamponade," Margaret said. Her voice remained level. The on-call surgeon was in traffic. The attending resident had not been notified yet. The patient's blood pressure was 67 systolic and dropping. The procedure was indicated. "I understand," Foster said, and Margaret could see in her face that she genuinely did understand, that she was not enjoying this, that she was trapped in the same institutional machinery Sterling had set in motion. "But it is outside your scope of practice. A nurse cannot perform invasive procedures. You understand that. You've completed the training. This is the boundary we cannot cross." "The patient would have died," Margaret said simply. "Yes," Foster agreed. "And you saved his life. But you did it by breaking protocol. And I cannot allow that to set a precedent." Foster removed Margaret's badge from an envelope on her desk, the plastic laminate catching the fluorescent light. "You are suspended pending termination for performing a procedure outside your scope of practice. You will not return to this unit. Your access to all hospital systems is being deactivated immediately. Human Resources will contact you tomorrow with information about your termination hearing, where you will have the opportunity to present your perspective." The woman in the blazer, the consultant, said nothing. She simply made notes on a legal pad, documenting everything, making sure the hospital's position was ironclad from a legal standpoint. Nobody could accuse Mercy General of being careless. They had conducted a swift, professional, sympathetic but firm separation of an employee who had violated scope of practice, no matter what her intentions had been. Margaret took the badge. She set it on the desk. She stood up without being asked. "I understand," she said, and her voice sounded exactly the same as it had in the ICU, steady, measured, empty of emotion because emotions were for people who had the luxury of feeling them. She walked out of the CNO's office and down the stairs to the parking garage, still wearing her scrubs because changing out of them would have required stepping back into the nursing locker room, and she couldn't face that yet. The afternoon sun hit the concrete in the garage with the weight of something physical. Her car was a 2006 Honda Civic that had belonged to a staff sergeant's wife before she inherited it, and in the trunk, underneath the spare tire, were a pair of worn combat boots with the heel damage that came from too many long days in Helmand Province, the laces still tied from the last time she had taken them off 8 years ago. She sat in the driver's seat. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She stared at the steering wheel for approximately 7 minutes while the temperature inside the car climbed and the light shifted, and somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Sterling was probably making another call or reviewing another email, already moving on to the next thing, already confident that the machinery of institutional authority would handle the rest. Margaret drove home to her apartment on Bellaria Boulevard, 32 minutes away depending on traffic. Traffic was light at 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday. She made the drive in 29 minutes. She parked in her assigned space. She climbed the stairs to the second floor where she had lived for 3 years without anyone knowing anything about her beyond her name and her shift. She sat on the floor of her living room with the afternoon light coming through the windows, and she watched the light move across the wall until the sun set and the room went dark, and she sat there in the darkness without turning on a light, waiting for something, rescue, reckoning, revelation, that she couldn't quite name. Segment 5 of 5. 3 days. That's how long Margaret Walsh sat in the waiting room of the VA hospital in downtown Houston, not as the caregiver who had stitched men back together in the dark, but as a patient herself, holding an intake form that trembled between her hands like a confession she couldn't make. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with the particular hum of institutional neglect, the kind of sound that burrowed into your bones and never left. Around her, veterans in wheelchairs and young soldiers still learning how to walk without phantom limbs averted their eyes from her civilian clothes, jeans and a grey hoodie pulled up to hide what 3 years of invisibility had purchased. A nurse called a name. Not hers. A man across from her stared at nothing, and Margaret recognized the 1,000-yard stare because she'd worn it herself in mirrors for months after Marjah. She knew exactly what lived behind those eyes. Pain. Isolation. The knowledge that nobody who hadn't been there could possibly understand. The intake form asked questions like weapons and methods and whether she had a support system. Margaret's pen hovered over each line without descending. She'd survived ambushes in Helmand Province, roadside explosives in Sanjan Valley, the screams of men bleeding out in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter, and she couldn't write the truth that Dr. Sterling had done what Taliban mortars couldn't. He'd taken her name. He'd taken her authority. He'd taken the anonymity that had been the only armor left standing between her and the memories that lived in the dark corners of her apartment. Within 18 hours of her pericardiocentesis on Colonel Mercer, the hospital's administrative machinery had moved with the oiled precision of an institution protecting itself. Her security badge had been deactivated at 9:27 a.m. Sterling's investigator had documented her medical intervention as an authorized procedure by unqualified nursing staff, a phrase that made her jaw clench so hard her teeth ached because the investigator had never seen a field surgical kit, never watched a woman hold someone's heart together with her hands while helicopter rotors shook the sky. Her phone sat on the waiting room chair beside her, untouched for 72 hours. She hadn't responded to the 2 messages from Marcus Chen, the hospital's IT director. She hadn't checked her email. She'd stopped answering calls around the time she sat on her apartment floor and watched the light move across the walls like she was already a ghost. What nobody understood was that losing your job wasn't the worst part. Losing your invisibility was. For 3 years, Margaret had been the quiet nurse on night shift, the one nobody asked questions about, the one who could exist without being examined. She'd been safe inside that smallness. Now her face was attached to an investigation. Her prior employment in California was under review, and that prior employment had been at a military medical facility in San Diego, which meant someone would eventually ask questions about why a decorated SEAL medical officer had abandoned that career for a night shift position in Houston under a completely different application. The walls were closing in like a decompression chamber, pressure building in her chest until she couldn't breathe properly. The old Margaret would have waited. The old Margaret would have accepted Sterling's calculated destruction with the same composure she'd shown when he threw her charts at her feet. But that Margaret was 3 days into rock bottom, and rock bottom had a different physics. It didn't let you hide anymore. It didn't let you disappear. It made you small in ways that made invisibility impossible. But that wasn't the worst part. On the 4th day, before Margaret could finish the intake form, her phone rang. The hospital's main line. She didn't answer. It rang again. And again. At 8:37 a.m., a text arrived from an unknown number, conference room. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Margaret drove to Mercy General with her hand steady on the wheel, but something inside her had shifted. The old Margaret, the one who could hide inside a uniform, was waking up. She could feel her moving through her muscles like muscle memory reactivating. She could feel the weight of her own authority returning like a weapon being placed back in her hands. The board had convened. She could smell it in the air when she walked through the administrative level, the particular scent of institutional fear mixed with the antiseptic sharpness of people about to make a decision they hoped would stick. Sterling sat at the table, his face arranged in an expression of professional concern, and Margaret recognized it immediately as the face of a man who believed he'd already won. He'd called the board members who owed him favors. He'd had her record reviewed. He'd documented her suspension with enough administrative language to make it permanent. In his mind, Margaret Walsh was already gone. The chair opened for her at the far end of the conference table, the position of the accused. Margaret sat down without acknowledging anyone. The board chair began to read the charges: unauthorized procedure, violation of protocol, endangerment of patient. Sterling leaned back in his chair with the satisfied posture of a man watching his plan unfold exactly as intended. He'd never served in the military. He'd never stood in a tactical operations center while someone described an ambush in real time. He had no idea what was about to walk through that door. A wheelchair. That's what came first. The sound of rubber wheels on tile preceded the man in them, and when Colonel Marcus Mercer wheeled himself into the conference room with his dress uniform starched despite the chest tube still draining from his incisions, the air pressure in the room changed. 2 aides followed. And then Margaret's son, in his Delta Force battle dress uniform, stood at attention in the corner of the room like a sentinel. Margaret didn't move. She didn't acknowledge him. But her hands, resting on the table, unclenched for the first time in 72 hours. Mercer looked at her face for exactly 3 seconds. His eyes, the color of weathered graphite, the kind of eyes that had seen entire villages burn, closed for a moment. When he opened them again, he whispered a single word that made Margaret close her eyes: Valkyrie. The board chair frowned. Sterling's posture straightened, uncertainty flickering across his face for the first time. And then Margaret's son spoke in the precise, crisp voice of a military officer addressing superiors. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. United States Navy SEAL Team 3. Charlie Platoon. 12 years active service. 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan. Medical discharge, 2019. A nurse with trembling hands, actually trembling, Margaret noticed, while she remained completely still, stepped forward with a sealed personnel file, and the board chair opened it with the expression of someone who'd just been told the math didn't work the way he'd calculated. The medals began as simple words on a page. Bronze Star. The board chair stopped, looked up from the file, and read it again as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less significant. Another Bronze Star. Sterling shifted in his chair. His fingers drum-tapped on the table, a sound like a clock ticking down. A SEAL team leader who'd flown overnight from Camp Lejeune stood beside Mercer's wheelchair, and when he began to speak, his voice carried the particular weight of a man describing things that changed the mathematics of heroism forever. 47 personnel. Combat situations. Marjah. Helmand Province. Sanjan Valley. Field medical interventions under fire. The team leader paused. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the building's vac system humming through the walls. 2 Purple Hearts, he said. The words landed like ordnance. And then, the singular decoration that made Sterling's face drain of color, the moment when the investigation he'd so carefully constructed collapsed like a house built on sand: Navy Cross. For Valor in combat. Margaret didn't move. She didn't blink. She watched Sterling's face cycle through denial, then anger, then the particular expression of a man watching his entire institutional power structure collapse in real time. He stood. He tried to leave. But Mercer spoke, and his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd commanded men through ambushes and extraction operations. Sit down, Dr. Sterling. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Sterling Saturday. What happened next ended careers. Within the week, Marcus Chen, the hospital's IT director and a Marine Corps veteran who'd served in Fallujah with the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, presented security footage to the hospital's executive leadership. He'd been reviewing the cafeteria incident, Sterling's face as he knocked Margaret's lunch tray to the ground, the chart scattered at her feet, the smile on his face as he said, "Pick that up, sweetheart." But more importantly, Chen had documented Sterling's 2 a.m. access to the server room. The deletion attempts. The panic-driven effort to erase evidence that had already been backed up to 3 separate encrypted drives. By 6 a.m., Chen had submitted a comprehensive report to the State Medical Board, the hospital's CEO, and law enforcement. By noon, Sterling was on administrative leave. By the following week, the State Board opened a formal investigation. By month 3, Sterling surrendered his hospital privileges in a settlement agreement designed to avoid a public hearing that would have ended him far more completely. 2 years later, Margaret Walsh sat in an office on the 4th floor of Mercy General, Director of Trauma Services, sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the Houston Medical District like a geography of second chances. On her desk, beside her computer and a photograph of her son at his promotion ceremony to Delta Force Master Chief, sat a pair of worn combat boots. No longer hidden. No longer locked in a car trunk. No longer the secret she carried in silence. Every person who entered that office saw them. A young surgical resident had knocked just this morning, nervous about questioning an attending's treatment plan, and Margaret had listened and then picked up the phone herself and made the call. Yesterday, she'd implemented a new protocol, the one that should have existed the night Mercer crashed, that allowed nurses and residents to activate trauma responses without waiting for attending approval. Her son visited monthly now, finally understanding where the nightmares came from. Colonel Mercer sent Christmas cards with pictures of grandchildren. Marcus Chen ran a hospital-wide initiative training staff to recognize and report workplace abuse. And Dr. Sterling worked in a strip mall office park on the south side of the city, sitting at a folding table between a tax preparation service and a pawn shop, selling supplemental insurance policies to walk-in customers who didn't know his name used to mean anything at all. True class is what you do when the lights go out. When no one's watching. When it costs you something to do the right thing. Margaret had told a new resident that just last week, and the resident had written it down. She sleeps better now. If you've ever been the quiet one in the room, the person nobody asks about, the one everybody overlooks, there's someone like Margaret in your workplace right now. In your community. Sitting in a waiting room. Pushing a mop. Fixing engines in a garage. Invisible. Look closer. The ones who've already fought battles you'll never know about are often the ones holding everything together. Don't pick a fight with them. Don't underestimate them. Don't assume that quiet means weak. If you found this story compelling, hit that subscribe button right now. Stories like Margaret's need to be heard. Drop a like, leave a comment telling us about a time you were underestimated and what that taught you, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next incredible story of hidden strength and earned authority. We'll see you next time.